weird.
It's getting weird.
Hi everyone, I just really wanted to come up here and talk very briefly about something that I've been noticing on the TL. Ciao. So if you've been plugged into the internet and you're in the know, and especially if you're a Beyoncé fan, you have probably heard of or have already seen the film by Beyoncé called Black is King. Now, there's been a great deal of talking and discussion and fighting over this film, and honestly, I gotta hand it to our girl Beyoncé, because only she can be the only celebrity who can create this much buzz, this much talk about even a film trailer, talk less of the actual film itself. See, I have some notes because I have a lot to say. But today I wanted to talk about the critiques that have been lobbed against Beyoncé by many people on Twitter and even outside of Twitter. Regardless if you believe it isn't fair for people to critique Beyoncé based off of a film trailer, I think there's nothing you can do about it. Even though a trailer is a preview, it's still a form of medium, and people are totally free and valid in critiquing Beyoncé, even based off of a preview, even based off of a trailer, because it is still media. So from the film's trailer, we basically see a hodgepodge of African cultures. We see imagery of wealth, royalty, Moses, water, the typical things. It spurred on discussions about the Wakandafication of Africa. Now, if you were held up upon that term, I'm going to quickly explain it a little bit. Hopefully it'll make sense, because I think a lot of people saw that term, got caught up on that term, blew it off as Diaspora wars, and didn't really read to understand what Dr. Jade Bento, who's the person who coined the term, was trying to say. Because as you know, it's Twitter, and so people, write things off, and Twitter really is not really the best place to formulate ideas. But thank you to Dr. Bento for, this work. But I think I'm going to explain it very quickly so that people kind of understand what she meant by Wakandafication. So, like I said earlier, this term was coined by Dr. Jade Bento. But Dr. Jade Bento isn't limiting this idea to Wakanda. She simply used the term Wakanda because through Black Panther, what she described was very obvious. It was clear, from the start of the project. So what Dr. Jade Bento means by describing Wakandafication is that it is the reimagination of post-colonial, Africans and African descendants, in which we look towards or we desire a pre-colonial past that disproves our slaveness. Now, if you don't really understand what I mean by slaveness, I'm talking about our physical enslavement and also our ontological enslavement. If you don't know what I mean by that, it's very complicated. But I have some books in the description, and they should be able to help you out with figuring out what I mean by all of this. But she's talking both about our physical enslavement and our ontological enslavement. And so we create these reimaginations of us as kings and queens. And while that did exist, for many of the people who lived in the continent at that time and live on the continent today, that is not a reality. So like I said earlier, now I think a lot of people didn't quite read to understand what Dr. Bento was actually trying to say. It isn't really a conversation focused on cultural appropriation. Rather, it is a conversation centered around the narratives that we all create. Those of us in the diaspora and those of us within the continent, the narratives that we create about Africa. Beyoncé is not the only one who does this. Many of us do this. We visualize and imagine in Africa where there were kings and queens, capitalist wealth, abundance, and etc. While this did exist on a continent, like I said earlier, like, let's be real, this is not the reality for many, many Africans on the continent today. And it was also not the reality for many Africans on the continent in the pre-colonial era. Many of us were farmers, many of us were tradesmen, many of us were the town crier, many of us were the elders. Like, not all of us were kings and queens, and this is just a reality that we need to face. So why are we reaching for a colonialist and a capitalist wet dream of Africa that were exploitative when they did exist in the past and do not really exist for people on the continent today? Of course, the first thing people reach is, like, why can't I want to see Africans who are not starving children? I always see Africans who are starving children on TV. I just want to see Africans in their, glory, in wealth, and being kings and queens. And I totally get that. I totally do. But what I'm wondering is, like, where does your desire to see wealthy Africans come from? Does it come from a need to prove to Western sensibilities that Africans too have wealth? Africans too can have material possessions. Africans too can hoard wealth. Africans too can use capitalist systems to exploit others. Where does this desire to appeal to whiteness and white sensibilities, Western sensibilities more so, come from? Where does it come from? Why do you want to center the white gaze so heavily in the narratives of those who live on the continent? So if you want to learn more about what I had just said from the beginning, I would suggest 2 books for you. The first book I would suggest is On the Postcolony by Achille Mbembe. I'm pretty sure I said his name wrong. I apologize. And a second book is Black Skin, White Mask by Frantz, Fanon. Both books are great. They'll really get you thinking about the white gaze and why it is why we center it so much and how we need to decenter it, and the very real connotations, the disadvantages of constantly seeing Africa under this very Western gaze. So like I said earlier, this conversation spurred a lot of people to just write it off as diaspora wars. And I don't think that's a really fair thing to do, especially when Africans on the continent themselves are also saying that these narratives are very limiting. We need to discuss this. Also, I would just like to note that people were also talking about the fact that, like, what Dr. Bento was describing does not only occur within the diaspora. Not only African Americans do this, Africans do this, Africans who live in Europe do this, Africans who live in Canada do this. All of us within the diaspora do this because of our positioning in this world through slavery and colonization. It is not an issue only AAs talk about and only AAs do, and it's not a narrative that only AAs buy into. Africans buy into it all the time. I literally saw a post today with somebody talking about how we need to see Africans wealthy because it's corrective promotion. But what is that? What is that? Why is your sense of wealth so tied to capitalism and exploitation of other people? Why? And I'm not even going to exempt myself from this because I used to do the exact same thing people are talking about when I was younger. I grew up in Nigeria. Well, I was born in Nigeria. I lived there until I was young, and then I moved to Canada. And I grew up pretty middle class in Nigeria, and I also grew up pretty middle class in Canada as well. And of course, all the Nigerians I knew weren't starving. They weren't people who didn't have jobs. They were essentially were not poor, right? And this whole conversation also ties into how much our society hates poor people, but that's a different discussion. But I grew up, always constantly being like, well, why can't we see Africans who are rich? Why do we always have to see the poor, starving Africans? And, like, that is classism, you know, and on top of that, like, that is not the reality. Like, in my country, there are people who make less than $1 a day and they can't feed their children, and they can't afford to pay school fees. You know, there are big problems with wealth. There's literally abject poverty. Like, and for me, the tide changed when I went back to Nigeria. I've gone back a few times, but I went back when I was 15, and I was a little bit more, you know, I was definitely reading more, I was learning more, I was, you know, a baby feminist at the time too, and I went back and I just saw the huge disparities in wealth between, you know, my neighbor and people down the street, that I couldn't, in all good conscience, like, just navigate through the world thinking, why can't Africans be rich? Like, talking like that, because it's not the reality. And when you see that people are literally struggling just to feed their kids, you will feel some type of, like, it'll make you feel weird that you're using that narrative, that you're still, you know, dealing with these narratives. So again, I want to say these narratives are wrong, in my opinion, and you're free to disagree, but, you know, this is my opinion, because they are so heavily predicated upon what the West has to think. Listen, nobody gets to validate our narratives other than us. We do not need to rely on what the West has to say to validate the realities of people who live on the continent. And I'm going to say this, it's because, you know, I might be overstepping as somebody who is now in a diaspora, and right, like, I don't live on the continent. I haven't lived there in a good number of years, but really, the people who should be deciding these narratives are the people on the continent. It shouldn't be us. We shouldn't be deciding who gets to see who in what light, you know. And I understand where this need comes from, because, you know, so much of it is wrapped up in racism and xenophobia, but, like, we still do not get to decide what narratives are valid and which narratives are not valid. And okay, so for those of you who may not agree and think that, oh, you may just think, oh, it's only Africans within the diaspora who have these ideas. Here's a very great example. So if you've seen the TED Talk by Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, she's a Nigerian. Hi, y'all. I really messed up on Chimamanda's name, and I can't in good conscience let that happen, especially as a Nigerian. So I'm going to pronounce her name again. Her name is Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. Writer who identified, you know, she calls herself a feminist. And that was kind of shady. I wasn't trying to be shady, but yeah, she's a Nigerian feminist who's a writer. And she talks in this TED Talk called The Danger of a Single Story. She basically talks about how dangerous it is to see Africans under this stereotype, right? And she then, you know, presents her own story, which is that, you know, she didn't grow up seeing poor people. Like I said, she grew up reading, you know, Western books. She grew up, you know, with educated parents. She grew up with X, Y, and Z. Kind of like, you know, my middle class experience as well. You know, she is middle class as well, or probably even more than that. She also is kind of privileging this story, her story. But the reality is that many Nigerians do not get the opportunity to leave the country and go to school in the West. Many Nigerians do not get the opportunity to even have enough money to feed their kids, like I said earlier. And so privileging that story, that single story, and saying that's a corrective promotion, like she kind of did in the video. And I actually wrote a whole essay about this a few years ago when this first video came out, because that was what really troubled me. I understood the good that she was trying to say, and I really understood the message, but that was my gripe with that whole message. It was just like, this is a very middle class African, Afropolitan way of navigating the Western gaze, because the white gaze, Western gaze is still central even when you bring up a different story, right? A different story of wealth in comparison to the single story of people who are poor and who've never heard Mariah Carey sing and things like that. Like, you know, that you're still navigating under that. We see that the West still has these ideas about Africans. Why? it's because of this antagonistic relationship between the West and people who are African or descendants of Africans. And this issue has more to do with slavery, colonization, and also our ontological positioning as non-humans, or better yet, anti-humans, in comparison to people who are afforded the category of human. So anyone who's basically not black, you know. But yeah, basically what I'm saying is it has more to do with the narratives that we're running away from by, you know, focusing on the narrative kings and queens. So the narratives we're running away from, which is slavery and colonization, it has more to do with that than, oh, corrective promotion. Because in my opinion, that doesn't work. It has never worked, because there have been tons of Africans and descendants of Africans who have been innovative, you know, written, created so many amazing things, have wealth, and yet there are still these narratives about us, you know? So of course, when we turn these discussions on Twitter into, oh, there they go, Diaspora Wars, at it again, we kind of miss the meat of these discussions. And what I was really grateful that was brought up in these discussions is that there are definitely more similarities between those who live in continental Africa and those who live within the diaspora than we like to think. And a lot of what is happening over here has an interconnection, and it's been influenced, you know, by what's happening over there. Like, so for instance, people were talking about the disruption of kinship ties. And if you don't know what kinship ties are, it's, you know, familial ties. And often a lot of scholarship is focused on the disruption of kinship ties through slavery and how it impacted those who were enslaved that were moved, you know, forcibly moved to the new world. And we clearly see that because, you know, during slavery, families were broken up. That's a disruption of kinship ties. But what people don't often seem to think about is the kinship ties that were disrupted during slavery as it was happening on the continent. Like, many people were, you know, runaway slaves. Ooh, sorry guys, there's a bug in my room. Many people were runaway slaves who, you know, had to run, who joined different tribes, joined different groups, you know. Even the act of slavery within the continent, kidnapping people, that was a disruption of kinship ties on the continent, and it continued on during colonization as well. You know, kinship ties being disrupted on the continent sounds very similar to the kinship ties that were being disrupted in the States during slavery. Obviously, things are a bit different. You know, the contexts are a little bit different, but frankly, like, we see these disruptions similarly happening. Another thing people talk about is natal alienation. Now, natal alienation is kind of complicated. It's a big thing. People are still theorizing, talking about it. It's very interesting. But something that people talk about all the time is the sense of displacement. It doesn't go away. You know, it's a sense of displacement, you know, a sense of disruption that happens for those on the continent and for those, you know, outside the continent. For example, like my family's last name is Scottish. Personally, I'm pretty sure I have no Scottish family members. I'm pretty sure about that. Who knows? I've never taken an ancestry test because I believe they are shams, they're scams, and it's also a way for the government to have more of your DNA than they necessarily need. That's my gripe with that, but I've never done an ancestry test, but I think it's fairly reasonable to think I have no Scottish ancestry. So why is my last name Scottish? Simple. The area that my family is from in Nigeria, there was a lot of forced conversions. Like, a lot of people had to, you know, change their religion from the traditional ancestral practices that they used to do to Christianity and Catholicism. And so I'm so sure that my great-great-great-great-grandfather on my father's side was forced to change our name. And so now we have a name that isn't really ours, like, that we don't know what our real last name was. It's been changed, and we don't have the records to show what our real name was. So now I have this Scottish last name, very similar to lots of people in the Americas who, you know, were descendants of enslaved people who have Scottish, British, Irish last names. And like, you know, it's usually through enslavement, the process of slavery, and being forced to take on the name of your slave master. But you see that that is a disruption and that's a similar disruption. But we often like to think of these systems like the afterlife of slavery, colonization, and, you know, our ontological slaveness as being separate from one another, but it really is not. They're very similar and they're very interconnected. Now, that's not to say there aren't any differences. I agree there are differences, but I think there are similarities as well. I bring that up because I don't want any diaspora wars in my comments. I don't want anybody blaming anybody for anything. The reason why people brought this up is because of Beyonce's work, and it brought very important knowledge and ideas, and I just want people to engage and challenge what your preconceived notions are and actually read to understand, because Jade wasn't really talking about cultural appropriation. She was, you know, theorizing something much bigger than that, but some of us didn't read to understand, you know, and saw the word Wakandafication and freaked out. Oh, and also wanted to add 2 great books that describe everything I talked about the afterlife of slavery, colonization, ontological slaveness. The first book is Scenes of Subjection by Saidiya Hartman, and the second book is Slavery and Social Death by Patterson. Now, let's move on to the elephant in the room. The reason why you clicked this video, because, you know, I mentioned a certain person, you know, and the elephant is the Beehive and the queen bee herself, Beyoncé. Beyonce. Listen, I was very scared to make this video because, if I'm being real, the Beehive is an unhinged stan group. I mean, even Beyonce's publicist told them to calm down because they were moving mad. They were actually out here moving mad, and they are moving mad right now. People should not have to feel like they need to protect their Twitter accounts so that they don't get death threats from the Beehive. People should not feel like they have to talk about Beyonce in code so that the Beehive doesn't come under their comments and, you know, send them death threats over a celebrity that they don't know in real life. Somebody you don't know in real life, you're really going this hard for? Wow, y'all. It's getting strange. It's getting very strange. Listen, if you can't handle the critiques that are being made about Beyonce in good faith, the critiques about her use of Black radical aesthetics in her music and her calls for Black liberation while doing all of this to gain more money, while commodifying all of this for her own gain, there is an issue here then. I should not have to let people know that I, too, am also a Beyoncé fan, and I have been since I watched Crazy in Love on MTV Base as a kid when I was not supposed to be watching MTV Base. I should not have to say that so that Beyonce fans don't start commenting saying, oh, well, you're a hater. No, I'm not, but I can separate my love for her music from obsession and fanatical behavior. That's weird.
It's getting weird.
Well, so what is the issue with Beyonce's work that has been stressing the girls out? Because the girls are stressed out. It's simple, but it's also kind of complicated. Beyonce either uses Black radical aesthetics when her message is everything but within the Black radical tradition. For example, her Super Bowl show, in which she and her dancers were shown in Black Panther outfits, Black Panther imagery. Listen, You cannot use the aesthetics of the Black Panthers, who were communists, and you are a blazing capitalist. It's not clicking, it's not connecting. And these are the things that stress people out, you know. Or she does this thing where she is part of the homogenization and flattening of the continent in her ruminations and imagery of wealth and royalty in almost every recent record. Now, I'm not blaming her for this fully, because this issue also lays at the hands of Lion King and its reimagination of Africa, which is very problematic. And I'm aware that this project was for the Lion King, but people still have a right to critique her for all of this. Beyoncé is not a mindless person. You know, she creates her projects, is very hands-on, and so people have a right to critique what she's doing. Another defense people like to make about Beyoncé and her work is that she isn't the only artist who is wealthy and gives no qualms about reminding all of us brokies 24/7. And I agree, I totally agree. I mean, the one person I think who could be Beyoncé's counterpart in this is Rihanna, but there is a clear difference. Beyoncé is, like, nobody, absolutely nobody is as invested in Black radical aesthetics about Blackness as Beyoncé is, and nobody is able to do these huge projects like Beyoncé. And so when you mess with that and your aesthetics are there, but the message is empty, it's feeling a little hollow, a little shallow, people are going to pick up on it and people are going to talk about it. I mean, the aesthetics are beautiful. I'm not taking that away from her. They're beautiful. The movie is beautiful. The music is amazing, and that's what we love. And nobody does it like Beyoncé, y'all. And that's the truth. Nobody does it like her. But it feels very hollow when you are so aware of her wealth and her politics and her profession to capitalism. And we know Beyoncé does listen to these critiques, and so it's not like she's unaware of them. She knows what people are saying. But it kind of feels a little bit opportunistic at times, and pointing to the African artists who were involved in the project does not change my point. Now, I want to give Beyoncé grace, because I know there are people who are not making critiques in good faith. And so I hope this doesn't come off as me trying to, attack her fully. But I do think she is at the helm of this project. And when you are the face, you are the helm, you are the project, you are the package, people are always going to have something to say. And when you are, getting yourself entangled with these narratives, people will have things to say. So to end this video off, I will say this again. If you can't handle critiques made in general, made in good faith about Beyoncé and her use of Black radical aesthetics in her music and her calls for Black liberation, while also commodifying it for her own gain in her music, there is an issue here. So, you know who is another public figure that kind of reminds me of this Beyoncé debacle and the discussions that always come on when Beyoncé is talking about Black is king, Black is this, Black is that, is Obama. The discussions, especially when Black people are discussing Beyoncé and Obama, is very similar. So one day I'll make a video, not today. So thank you for watching, and as always, please share this video, comment, like the video, and also let me know what you think of all of this issues, these debacles that people are having about Beyoncé. Did you hear what Ms. Tita said about Black feminists, calling them terrorists? because they're challenging Beyoncé. Tell me what you think about stan culture, because I think it's a little bit fanatical and a little bit ridiculous, and some of y'all need some help. So let me know what you think down below. Okay, bye.